Is America on course in the 21st century? Jim Davis, a lawyer and former member of the U.S. Congress, thinks so. He'll explain why next on Global Perspectives.
This is Global Perspectives with Pulitzer Prize-winning commentator John Bercia.
Welcome to Global Perspectives. What role does a superpower have in today's world? Jim Davis, an attorney, a former member of the U.S. Congress, and a specialist in business and foreign affairs, has a broad base from which to evaluate the prospects. Welcome to the show, Jim.
Good to be with you, John.
Let's talk about the world of the 21st century and the whole superpower question. The United States is familiar with superpower status. It was the sole superpower at the end of World War II and then took on that title again in the 1990s as the Cold War ended. What does that mean? Is it an asset or is it a liability?
It's both, John. It is an enormous opportunity for us to do good when we get it right. It's also an enormous responsibility. Our military dwarfs most of the major countries put together now, both in terms of what we can accomplish and what we spend. So when we make decisions to engage in parts of the world, we try to leverage our resources, our power, get other folks involved. It's very important we get it right because we are the leader.
And in getting it right, does that mean necessarily serving U.S. interests 100% of the time, or is there an element of compromise that's necessary?
Well, I think it's both. You certainly have to put the United States interests first, but a lot of times what we are standing for is stability and for certain principles we believe in. And so often our interests are consistent with the global interests. But when we have other countries that have more parochial interests, trying to get them lined up in a timely fashion to work together is difficult. And again, we are the one that typically is putting in all the resources, so we tend to have the most influence.
In most parts of the world, we typically have a linchpin relationship. And in the Far East, it's been Japan for decades and decades. In the Middle East, it's been Israel for a long time. Are those linchpin relationships ones that you think will continue into the future because they've essentially always been there? Or do you anticipate that those will change as circumstances change?
Well, the world is changing. Certainly the countries you mentioned, we continue to have good relationships. I would add India to that. But there's a lot of emerging countries of influence. China is the best example. China has certain self-interests that coincide with ours. They're trying to grow their economy. They're interested in trade. We're open to free and fair trade with them. But they are also developing a national security agenda, and they want to grow. And in the case of the Far East and Japan, who's also an ally of us, there's going to be some conflict. So I think we have to be cognizant of the fact that there are other emerging countries in the world that we need to form relationships with and try to work together with.
Now, in the Middle East, we've also had a special relationship with Saudi Arabia for many decades for both economic and strategic reasons. Talk about that for a few minutes.
A lot of the Saudi relationship has been influenced by our relationship on energy. And I think that is changing as Canada becomes more of a resource and the United States finds additional resources for energy. I think that the energy issue is not going to be quite as paramount in our relationship with Saudi Arabia as it has been. That gives us some opportunities, it gives us some flexibility. Saudi Arabia continues to be an important ally in the region, and they are experiencing a lot of difficult issues right now with the countries surrounding them. So it's a very critical time in our relationship with them. The same is true with Egypt.
Now, there are other countries in the region that are having troubles, including Syria. How do you sort it out?
Well, Syria is a good example of what we just talked about, John. We as a country had difficulty grappling with which side to take and how to effectively engage in Syria because there's no clear opposition to President Assad there that is a potential ally of the United States. It really is utter chaos. And so we hesitated on that. The situation has gotten worse. We've gotten involved. But I think one of the responsibilities we bear, and this is partly the result of successes and failures we've had in the past, is learning about how to deal with a situation once you get in there. You can deal with the conflict, you can deal with a leader you don't like, but you've also got to deal with the aftermath. And you need to have people in the region, whether it's Syria or another country, that are ultimately going to take responsibility when we leave.
Is the Middle East one of those places where you anticipate the United States will have a firm interest for decades to come?
Yeah, well, the energy question is an important part of it, but it is an important part of the world. It borders Europe. It affects a lot of our allies. It borders Russia. which is a country that we could not ignore, we need to work with. We've had these long historic relationships, but it is very complicated. What needs to change in the Middle East is that more of the countries there need to take ownership over solving some of these problems, particularly once the military is no longer involved, because a lot of the issues exist because there is not in place the institutions to create a civil society. The United States can only do so much. We can support them in terms of their military activity. We can work with them on commercial issues, but ultimately building stable, steady governments is something they have to take responsibility for.
But are there any that are rising that you can point out that seem to be on the right track?
Well, I think that Jordan is holding their own. Egypt is going through a change where I think they're trying to get some stability and return to working with us. But I think the bad news is that there's a lot of turmoil in the Middle East right now. I don't think we know exactly how this Syria situation ends. We don't know exactly how the Iranian situation ends, although the leader that was elected by the people there seems to be somebody that we can work with. Saudi Arabia has a new leader, so there's going to be some change there. So I think in the Middle East, there is a lot of unknowns. But what also happens to us as a country is we cannot deal with every part of the world at one time. And the attention we are focusing on the Middle East is to the exclusion of other parts of the world, like Central and South America, that are so important to the future of our state here in Florida.
Now, you're interested in, and have been for a long time, in education, and education is clearly part of the solution to what's happening in the Middle East. You've traveled there extensively. What is your sense of what the education system there needs?
Well, ironically, what I've experienced from travel is that the issues they face in these countries are the same issues we face. The best example is young men who are going to get involved in something good or something bad. They want to belong to something good or something bad. They want to have hope. They want to have a sense of opportunity. We grapple with these issues every day in our neighborhoods and cities here in Florida. In Saudi Arabia, finding a way to create an education system where people develop job skills they can use is the same issue throughout the Middle East. When I was in Iraq, I went to a school in Baghdad, and I walked around a classroom, and those young men and women wanted the same things that our children and grandchildren want here. But the problem is, in a lot of these countries, the government has not organized itself. They have not come to grips with equality among the genders. And it takes a long time to create an institution and produce graduates, both at the grade school level and at the university level.
Let's talk about the energy issue, since it's connected not just to the Middle East, but to the United States. Do you think the United States is going to be energy independent by the close of this decade? And is that a good thing? Are we looking at the right kinds of energy issues?
We spend a lot of our money on energy, and there's a lot of good things happening right now. We're learning ways to do deep water drilling, not near the coast of Florida, that are more efficient and safe. Natural gas has been plentiful. We're learning to use renewable in a way that is cost effective and is attracting entrepreneurs. So that is all a good thing. If you are from a state like Texas or Oklahoma that's been depending on the usual way to do energy, you need to be awfully careful because the world is changing. Ultimately, I think there'll be plenty of engagement with the Middle East and other parts of the world because we want to trade with everybody. We want to work together. But I think being less dependent on Saudi Arabia and other countries to make sure that we have stable energy prices that are not upsetting our economy is a very good thing. It is a noble goal, and we should all unite behind that.
The Middle East has been plagued by political problems for as long as we've been around and long before that. Do you see some of this eventually coming to a close with governments finding the right track, or do you think we're in for another several decades of turmoil and disruption?
A lot depends upon what people want. I'll tell you a story. I was in Babylon after the war, and this gentleman who'd lived in Iraq for centuries, his family, was giving us a tour. And I said, now that Saddam Hussein is gone, what do you think? He said, I'm tired. A lot of my relatives have been murdered. I just want a break. And I said, sir, with all due respect, this is your time. This is the time your relatives have been waiting for. This is the time your family has sacrificed for. This is your opportunity to step up and do something for your country. So ultimately, what depends is what the people there want. That's what's going to determine the future of these countries, whether it's Iran, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, or Iraq. There's only a certain amount we can do. But the world is changing. Social media has made a lot of our values, a lot of the things people like about our country, more visible and inspiring to young people in these countries. And it's going to be a difficult period of deciding how these countries can govern themselves. They certainly aren't prepared to be democracies. But if they are willing to go in the right direction, there's a lot we can do to support them.
There are other parts of the world that have not had as much conflict and trouble as the Middle East, and I'm thinking specifically of Europe. Now we have turmoil coming from Ukraine, coming from Russia. Do you see this as something that is manageable, or is it something that could upend the decades of progress that we've seen in Europe broadly defined?
Well, you can't ignore what Russia is doing, and Putin has certainly developed an aggressive agenda to consolidate territory, to take advantage of historical views about growing the old Soviet Union again. But ultimately what he's dealing with is his economy. And so I think we need to find ways to engage Russia in our economic interest and theirs, and support any countries in that part of the world that want to be a partner to the United States. Many of these former Soviet countries would like to be part of the global economy, and they have resources and technology and scientists and engineers who want to engage. So I think, again, based on the behavior that Putin is exhibiting, we've got our hands full dealing with that on top of all the other issues we've talked about.
What has been your personal response to all of this? Our parents experienced Great Depression, World War II, and so forth, and grandparents. And we seem to be on course to a better life in so many ways, and it has been true to a large extent. But when you first started seeing scenes of the fighting in Ukraine, what did it do to you? How did it affect you personally?
I have not been to the Ukraine, so let me give you a more general response to that. What I've learned from my service in Congress and travel to other countries since, that at the end of the day, we all pretty much want the same thing. We may worship a little differently, we may look a little differently, we may speak a little differently, but we all want the same thing for ourselves and our families. And the world really is a small place. There is only so much we can do as a superpower to assist, but I think having people traveling between the United States, we need to protect our borders, make sure we know who's coming in, that there are no threats that we're allowing to take place. But the exchange is very powerful. And I think people are bridges between countries. The other thing I think, I particularly saw this after 9/11 when I was in Congress, is this rising generation of young people really are very curious about the world, and they want to engage. And we want to encourage them to travel abroad, where they get involved in non-for-profits, where they get involved in the military, our intelligence community. We want to encourage young people from other parts of the world to visit us. So I think it's an exciting time in terms of young people that want to make a difference, and we should be supporting them to be a part of some of the solutions to a lot of these very challenging global problems.
When you think about young people going out into the world today, whether it's in the global economy or in some other capacity, what are the skills that they ideally should have to compete, to take full advantage of the opportunities, and to ward off dangers and challenges?
Right. Well, a lot of this is perseverance. I know a young lady from Tampa that went to Africa and started a school for women and was very discouraged at first, but stayed there and got it done. The other is that good intentions are not enough. You've got to be smart. You've got to understand that there are different cultures. Whether they do it better or worse than us doesn't matter. People come at this from a different place. You have to earn trust. But if you earn the trust of somebody in another country, there's a lot of things an individual can do that the government can't do. And so I think the non-for-profit community, whether it's educating young women or building civil societies in Africa, other parts of the world, is a very exciting opportunity right now for young people.
What advice, if you were talking to your own child who was about to embark on such an adventure, what would you share with that person?
Well, I have two sons, and I'm giving them a lot of advice.
I figured you had.
That's where the gray hairs come from, John. I think follow your heart. If you want to be a part of a solution, some of these issues we've been talking about, both the large issues and the small issues, pick something you really care about and get in there and make a difference. There are countless examples. Africa, again, is a very good example, where a dollar goes a long way. When you're educating young women in Africa, you are lifting up the family, you are building institutions, you're building jobs, you are raising a village. So pick something you care about, stick with it, and go for it. Not everybody has the luxury with the amount of student loans out there and just coming out of this recession to do something like that. But there's a lot of very worthy non-for-profit organizations. I also think we need more people that are willing to enlist in our diplomatic corps, in the intelligence community, in the military. This military today aren't just soldiers. These are brilliant diplomats and politicians. I see this over in Tampa at Central Command and Special Ops. So there are many ways you can serve your country right now and really make a difference.
There are those who say that, yes, there are other parts of the world that have needs, but why not focus on our hemisphere? Why not direct our efforts toward our neighbors north and south?
Well, that's been my passion. I was very active here in domestic issues and left to run for governor for that reason. I still am very concerned about the quality of education in our state and that we need to do more. So I do think it does start at home, but the world is a small place and you don't have to choose between helping people abroad and doing things here. But one of the things that I've taught my sons, I think, is to experience the joy of service. When I was a young man, I thought I wanted to have a big fancy car, that was going to be what gave me satisfaction. What's given me satisfaction and continues to do is serving people and helping people. Sometimes it's just one at a time. And I think as our young people, and all of us, I mean, we've got a lot of people retiring that are looking for things to do. You get out and help people, whether it's in the neighborhood or whether you're helping somebody abroad, there is tremendous joy and satisfaction in service.
But in Latin America and the Caribbean specifically, I know you've had an interest in that region. Where do you see the opportunities in those places?
Well, the economies are growing dramatically in a lot of these countries right now. Colombia, Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina. And so I think, particularly for us as Floridians, there are enormous opportunities to do business with these countries, help them build their infrastructure, help them support their middle class, whether it's consumer products or creating a stable system of the economy and government. And there are so many people that have immigrated here to the Orlando area, to Miami, and to my home area, Tampa, from these other countries. And these are the bridges. Cuba is another example of that. So I think we in Florida have a particular opportunity to be part of that gateway.
Talk to us about Cuba. You mentioned that, and it seems to be on everybody's minds these days. We've had a contentious relationship for decades. It now seems to be changing. What is your opinion?
Well, first of all, there are a lot of Cubans living here in the United States. When I went down to Cuba when I was in Congress, I came back and people called me and said, "I'm glad that you ran into my father." I was stunned. And this has been the history of Florida and Tampa and Miami and many other parts of the state. There are plenty of Cuban folks here in the Orlando area as well. So again, I think that's an important stepping stone. This administration has relaxed some of the rules on travel, so it is much less difficult for people to travel to Cuba to see their family or to see their own hometown. I hope more people will take advantage of that. I think the political change is going to come very slowly. A lot depends upon what happens with the Cuban government. They still have an horrendous record on political, civil, and human rights, and we need to continue to find ways to pressure them on that. But change is coming. It's only 90 miles from our coast in Key West, and I think the day is going to come, before we know it, that there's going to be a lot of trade between the United States and Cuba.
Talk to us about something I've always found interesting. I've traveled quite a bit with former members of Congress, and they seem to carry that congressional cachet with them wherever they go. In fact, typically, if there's a former member of Congress in the group, he or she is the first one approached by the host, as if, and oftentimes that he or she isn't the head of the delegation. But what is that mystique about the former member of Congress, especially in other countries?
You left out the part where they probably get more honor and respect abroad than they do at home.
Well, I didn't say that.
Yeah, I've experienced that, and take it with the appropriate dose of humility. I think that when you have been elected to represent people and have that public trust, when you go abroad, you realize how precious that is. This is one of the things people deeply admire about our country. The fact that we can elect people, that we can come together after election, we can have a peaceful transition to power, doesn't happen very often in the countries we've talked about today, John. And so I think people see that as a real privilege and something special about the United States. And when you've had a chance to serve in that capacity, you've been part of something very special. And I think when we go abroad, it's a chance to tell people about our country. We don't always get it perfect. We let people know how we're doing it. And I think it reminds us why we're so fortunate to be Americans.
And it wasn't that many years ago that we used to have a consensus, at least on foreign policy issues, broadly defined. The idea that separation ends at the water's edge, and we have to be united as Americans. Do you sense that we could move back in that direction, that the pendulum could swing toward more of a consensus, at least on foreign policy issues?
Yeah, we certainly have lost a lot of ground with current events lately. We have to do that. We have to come together as a country. It's what people expect, and frankly, it's what our allies expect. They expect us to speak with a single voice, and we confuse everybody, including our opponents, when we don't. So I think this next election for president is going to be an opportunity to talk about how we work together as a country. When we are threatened, we are tight. We work together. But the harder part is when we're trying to make difficult decisions for the long term, how you engage in Syria, how you engage in Cuba, how you engage in the Middle East with China. And people do expect their leaders to work together, and we can do a better job.
Help me with this question. I've been, like you, through a lot of presidential elections, and oftentimes, especially if there are major developments happening in the world, people say, oh, well, foreign affairs should be a bigger part of the debates. It should be a bigger part of the discussions throughout the campaigns. And invariably, that's not the case. And then people lament the fact that there weren't enough foreign affairs discussions after the election. How do we fix that so that we begin those discussions early and they continue throughout the elections, ideally including the presidential debates?
Unless we are threatened or at war, it's really difficult to get people's attention focused on that. Frankly, people are so busy and disillusioned with politics, it's hard to get their attention focused on issues that directly affect them. But I think the one thing I would say, particularly in the presidential election, that character counts tremendously. And a lot of the decisions that affect the issues we've discussed today in these countries are the prerogative of the president. Congress has a role to play. And so who you elect matters a great deal, because ultimately you're not electing somebody based on an issue or foreign policy. You're electing somebody because you have confidence in their leadership skills, their experience, and their values. And so I think this is going to be a very important election about how we use our power as a superpower. And I think here in Florida, where we experience such a rich diversity of nationalities in terms of origin and family, I think we'll be sensitive to that. And I think, once again, Florida will be a key state in electing the next president.
Talk to us about what you do to escape all of these serious issues that seem to have dominated your professional life throughout. Is there some favorite activity you have that allows you to separate from such issues and de-stress?
I'm not very good at that, John, if you've probably noticed. I get into this issues. But I am a dad, and my sons are both graduated now from college with their music degrees, so I describe myself as an involuntary patron of the arts. And my wife and I enjoy our time together, but I still read the newspaper pretty closely every day. I run a lot. One of my friends is Joe Scarborough, who I served in Congress with. I tell Joe when I watch his show, it makes me run faster on the treadmill. So I think engaging with people, learning, which is the fun part about politics, finding ways to work together. I find that relaxing. I find that fun. A lot of people think that sounds like work. My wife certainly does.
I've known a lot of current and former political leaders who kept a very accurate, detailed diary of daily activities, especially during the time in office, with the idea that they might write a book or do something else that would require such information. Is that something you've done? Do you intend to do any large-scale writing?
Good question. I am also guilty of not taking enough time to reflect. At this stage in my life, I've also thought about whether I ever want to teach. I still want to engage. I am looking for ways to try to make a difference as a citizen, to support people that are elected, Democrat or Republican, people that are running that I think can make a difference. And so at this stage in my life, that's what I'm focused on. But I've seen a lot, and I do like to write, and the day may come when that happens. My grandfather wrote an autobiography about his life and the history of Florida, and that's something we're passing down through generations in our family, and I probably should do something like that.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Jim Davis.
Thanks, John.
And thank you. For Global Perspectives, I'm John Bercia, and we'll see you next time.